This is across Canada with Ford. It was produced by Ford Motor Company in 1925 in celebration of their 25th anniversary. We don't know the names of any of the people who made it. We don't know the names of 95% of the people who star in it. There is very little background information on the production of this film strip, but suffice it to say, it does involve Ford taking a car on a road trip across all of Canada, both to celebrate their birthday, to show off the Canadian road and railway network, and also conveniently for Ford to advertise their new update to the Ford Model T. It's worth noting this wasn't the first crossing of Canada by car. That was done in 1912 by a British journalist named Thomas Wilby. But this was, as far as we know, the first time a car crossed the entire country on its own power. And you'll notice, of course, in the intertitles, they did a great deal of it riding on the rails. We'll see more of that process later on. Of course, you could also argue, and Alex, I think you are now morally obligated to argue, if they did a railway crossing of Canada in a car, does it still count as being in a car?
Well, they were under their own power, so that was really the key. And we'll see how quickly they have to get into using rail bridges to navigate the country.
Yeah, if you're a fan of rail bridges, you are going to love this film. My goodness. So this is what you're about to see is a painting, unfortunately not video or film footage of the Ford plant in what was then Ford, Ontario. This was a separate neighborhood of Walkerville that then became part of Windsor. It covered several hundred acres. And at the end, you'll notice the famous big Ford of Canada sign up along the buildings, which unfortunately was actually melted down for scrap metal during the Second World War. This was probably the largest industrial complex in Canada and certainly one of the largest in North America at the time. And Ford was very keen to show off how high-tech they were. You may have seen some or almost all of this footage, in fact, in a YouTube video we produced a while back, just talking about the production of the cars, but it's really a fascinating glimpse into Ford's industrial empire. I'm quite fond of the little motorized buggies or platform trucks they've got driving around. This is part of the company's engine building, 900,000 square feet. And you'll notice lots of big windows. That was the Ford signature. It was put together by the American industrial architect Albert Kahn, who kind of became known for his big industrial buildings with tons and tons of natural light. And yeah, as the intertitle says, this is indeed, or was indeed at the time, an all-Canadian car, and one made at least partially with all Canadian materials. They were shipping a lot of raw materials in and processing them on site. Lots of Ford advertising at the time brags about bringing in, iron from Canadian mines that is refined into steel and Canadian mills that is turned into car parts like these here. The fact that they had a forging plant on site is quite unusual for the time. The vast majority of even large Canadian car manufacturers in the 1920s were still importing parts from bigger plants in the United States. It wasn't particularly nice work or safe work by any means, but it was very much a sign of prestige that Ford Canada could forge their own stuff on site, and did. Ditto the stamping. Ford made a lot of use of stamped metal, especially for the 1925 Fords or 1925 and 26s. And you'll notice at a bunch of different steps, they're trying to do sort of as many operations at once as possible. They're milling out dozens of engine blocks or 44 holes in one cylinder block all at one go, all in the pursuit of greater and greater efficiency and lower costs to sell Model T Fords cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. the bigness is really worth emphasizing here. This factory, at the time this was filmed, employed more than 5,000 people, and produced something like 70% of all cars in Canada, regardless of origin. It is just an astonishingly large operation. And, it's an operation on a scale that allowed them to bring the price of a Model T Ford from just under $1,000 Canadian when they started to just over 300 when they finally went into production in 1927. Incidentally, if you're listening to In the Court of the Crimson King, if I'm not mistaken, this exact segment lines up with a line where they talk about grinding things on wheels, which, if that's not serendipity, I don't know what is. So there was lots of prefabrication of large units of parts at Ford factories. That was another construction technique they didn't invent, but they certainly pioneered, the ability to pump out, a set of identical partial body frames that could be very quickly riveted and or partially welded together. The all steel body was a big new feature for that year's Fords, and you'll see them show off how strong it is at several points during this video. The previous Model Ts had been sort of mostly wood with a metal skin and skeleton. These new Fords, there isn't really a formal name for them beyond that, were mostly steel with wood elements added in. One thing that actually changed a great deal with the new Fords was paint. We're actually in the process of researching an exhibit on the history of car paints and the importance of Ford's lacquer spraying techniques for making car paint very inexpensively. The big innovation with these ones was, for the first time in more than a decade, you could buy a Ford in a color other than black. The new Fords were available in black or very, very dark green, and that was a big deal for the time. Now, they're going to show off the engines a lot here on this moving engine assembly line. One unusual step that we're missing from the assembly line process that they'd taken out of the running fairly recently was that up till 1919, all the engines made in the Canadian Ford factory actually had the Made in USA stamp grinded off of them, because the part that included that stamp still had to be shipped in. By 1925, they were genuinely made in Canada, though. The easy way you can tell a new Ford, because they do look very similar to the old Model Ts, is the sideboards and mudguards on the front wheels are much, I guess the term you could use is swoopier, much larger and rounder. So this is the introduction of arguably the protagonist of our story, the Trans-Canada car, which they claim was randomly picked off the assembly line. Who knows if that's true, for this road trip across the country. And this is it. You're going to see a great deal of this car over the next 50 minutes or so.
We're ready to go.
Yeah, drive it straight off the assembly line. I think they talk about adding some mods to it. Yes, back when a speedometer was a special equipment add-on for a one-of-a-kind car. Important thing to compare is how clean and new it is now versus how it's going to look at the end of this movie. It's almost unrecognizable. So a weird bit of trivia I learned in the process of researching this film is what you're about to see is some of the only good wide shot footage of Halifax Harbor in the 1920s. And this like 3-second chunk of film has been pored over by Nova Scotian film historians for years, because apparently nobody else was sitting on a roof in Halifax with a movie camera in the 1920s for whatever reason. But that what you're seeing right now is the best roof shot of Halifax taken at that time. And September 8th, they're off. Well, not before they show off the car first.
There we are, 99 years ago? 100 years ago?
Yeah, actually, yeah, that's true. Yeah, 99 years. Not quite to the day, but we're pretty darn close. I wish I'd planned that. That's a very good point.
I should have held off for a year on the talk.
Yeah. Well, we'll just have to rerun it next year with a live soundtrack. So you'll notice a lot of I'm very, very curious about, because we don't know very much about the backstory of this, the sort of buy-in from all the mayors along the way. They devote a lot of time to showing off the mayors of each of the town and talking about this letter that was sent from the mayor of Halifax to the mayor of Vancouver. Um, there are definitely some towns were way more into, excuse me, into this project than others, and you'll see differing levels of, I guess, pomp and circumstance around the arrival of these cars. One thing we haven't been able to find very much of in our research is like media coverage. Um, Not very much in the newspapers about this trip, surprisingly, because clearly there was a great deal of, excitement about it in the individual towns it went through. But as much as Ford, clearly put a lot of time and money into this whole project, there don't seem to have been much media buzz about it. Yes, this is a famous Canadian road trip tradition. You dip the back wheels into the Atlantic and eventually dip the front wheels in the Pacific. I think Thomas Wilby started that in 1912, though he was famously not a very nice man, so who knows if his traditions can be trusted.
It's worth noting we don't have a Newfoundland and Labrador yet.
Yeah.
So nowadays you would have to do a bit of a longer trek, though we don't have Keewatin either anymore. So that's the trade-off here.
Yeah. Though it is after Manitoba has assumed its modern borders. It's almost the modern map of Canada, not quite. So take a close look at the front of the car here. They'll show it more, but as time goes on, it acquires more and more badges from various local clubs and organizations. It really, they deliberately put a lot of work into the car telling the story of where it had been.
Look how easy this road is going to be across Canada.
Yeah,
Very, very hopeful at the start.
yeah, nice garages. Everybody's well dressed. The weather's great, sunny.
It seems like, from what we've learned, like surprisingly good roads in Nova Scotia at the time that they're showing compared to.
Yeah, they don't seem to have any trouble crossing the Maritimes at all. It's Ontario where things get bad. Um, it may be, this is a time when bicycle tourism was very popular in the northeastern United States. It may be that these were good bicycling roads that had held over, or maybe even we're overthinking this. These were shorter roads and thus less expensive to make. But this is long before the idea even of provincial road building was very common. So this seems like an odd aside to have a bit about fox farming, but in researching this, we learned PEI alone at this time had 500 plus fox farms. It was the fox fur catching was one of the single largest cash industries in the entirety of maritime Canada, and was in some places as big or bigger than fisheries by an order of magnitude. So I guess it made sense at the time. If you're going to the Maritimes, you stop at a fox farm, but I don't think that's stuck around very much. Yeah, so just, casually, a single fox pelt is worth 3 of the car they're driving, give or take. It puts things in context. Yeah, we're already halfway through New Brunswick, which raises the question of what we've missed. Now, you'll notice watching this these roads are all gravel. The gravel road was the standard in Canada at the time. We'll see a bit more of it later, but suffice it to say, even if your community doesn't have cars, as long as you've got horse-drawn carriages, you can make gravel roads at least. It's amazing how comparatively little the skyline of Quebec has changed. Admittedly, it's missing the big spinning restaurant, but beyond that, from the Lévis side, this is still not dissimilar to what this corner of Quebec looks like today. Even at the time, it was a big international tourist site that was being partially kept in a deliberately old style. Oh yeah, so this is an important scene. This introduces first off the Pont Québec, the Quebec Bridge, and some unusual stuff that happens on it. But they're also going to introduce one of our main characters recurring through this, Perry Doolittle, the so-called father of the Trans-Canada Highway, who was really a leading voice at the time for the Good Roads movement. Now, from what we've seen, Ford really advertised Dr. Doolittle's involvement in this whole trip quite heavily, kind of bragged that he'd been along for the ride. As we'll soon see, that may not be entirely true. He was certainly involved, and he probably did the driving for this little stretch, but beyond that, there's some kind of editing trickery at work. This was, though, genuinely, so the Pont de Québec had been built in 1919. This was filmed in 1925, but as far as we know, this was genuinely the first time a car drove over the Pont de Québec. Nowadays, it's 4 lanes of very bad traffic, usually. But this is where it started.
Yeah, and this is going to be a theme for about a sixth or so of the trip.
Yeah.
Is going to be using CPR and CN lines going across Canada in places that there just were not roads yet 100 years ago. And we'll see that many times. I think it started off and said 14 times they're going to have to switch the wheels off in order to continue on this tour by rail. I think, I mean, if someone knows of other trips that had permission to do this type of thing, we'd love to know, because it seems to, there are cars that were outfitted for the railways, but usually you had to be a rail employee to be able to use such things. So this is quite an interesting undertaking by Ford with the logistics and the maps to get from one place to the other.
And as we'll see later, CP Rail especially clearly had some kind of buy-in on this. Like there's a lot of filming that is advertising the trains as much as it's advertising the cars.
Yep. And here's our toll.
No, I think that bridge
cents.
is still a toll bridge, or whatever's replaced that bridge is still a toll bridge. I have driven across it. Toll is now not 25 cents.
Not inexpensive in 1925.
No, not at all. You got to pay for the roads. Yeah, no trotting sign. So this is interesting. We'll see a few stops where they're sort of stopping at heritage sites that are conveniently along the highway. This was very much a deliberate thing. Lots of provincial governments were actually kind of relocating their heritage sites in the 1920s closer to the highway because it essentially made for better tourist income. It was more prevalent in British Columbia, but Quebec certainly did it too. A lovely view from Mount Royal.
Yes, not quite what Montreal looks like downtown anymore, but you can spot a few things. They don't spend much. They don't linger long.
I was on this highway this morning. I can confirm it still looks like that. potholes and all.
Okay, and crossing it into Ontario finally.
So this is the Parliament buildings at a weird time. They look basically identical to how they are now, but at the time they were actually a hollow shell. You may recall the Parliament buildings burned down in 1960, and they were still finishing off the reconstruction when this was filmed. They have some horse content, even in the 1920s. I love the higgledy-piggledy parking lot in the background in this shot. And lots of towns with very wide main streets from an era when there was a real mix of traffic going around.
Yeah, so they're going to cut across, so they're not going to swing into southern Ontario. So disappointingly, we're not going to have any shots of Oshawa, Toronto, Windsor, or any of those types of things, because they're taking the quickest way across the country.
Note that we're up to 4 hood badges from the original 1. And also notice the amount of dust. My goodness, this is why in old photographs people are always bundled up to drive, especially in Canada. Any kind of dry weather, and your car would inevitably fill up with dust and sand and little rocks. You also notice, even though we're in pretty rural Ontario between North Bay and Sturgeon Falls, the roads are still pretty good. The reason for this being this is logging country. There is now an industrial and commercial reason to have good roads here rather than just tourism. And when they sort of pass beyond the range of what was being logged at the time, suddenly the roads get way worse. This is also, I think, the only time we see any night driving in this next section in the whole film. If I'm not mistaken. Classic terrible Model T Ford headlights.
Very impressive for 1925, though.
Yeah, genuinely.
We'll just skip up to Sault Ste. Marie.
Yeah, yeah. Skip over half of Ontario. So they'll kind of lay out the timeline a bit better at the very end. But to give you a sense of scale, this whole trip took 40 days. So we're looking at 5 days a province, roughly on average. So they're cutting out huge chunks of time and making no effort to keep things 100% linear, other than in terms of geography.
And now we're at the end of the world.
Yeah.
Past Sault Ste. Marie, you can go no further west in Canada at this time by automobile. It turns into this sort of demonstration of off-roading, but clearly, clearly here they are demonstrating the mobility of a Model T on rough terrain, but there's nowhere to continue from here west. So we're gonna shortly jump back on the train tracks to get across the rest of Northern Ontario.
And, it's an off-roading demonstration. Well, you'll notice, other than literally running out of road, the car never gets stuck.
Yeah.
The car never once gets stuck in the mud. They were very keen to not show any of that in this film.
Yeah. One of the things you'll notice is that the telegraph lines do continue, and so those, are maintained by on foot, by horse, by the trains. So those had made it all the way across the country, so they sort of follow that route, but it's just not accessible by car. So here we go.
Yeah. Yeah, so one of the questions we've been trying to answer and looking at this footage is how many cars were in this caravan? Because it's definitely more than one. Best guess is three, but here we go, railway bridges. The first of the giant railway bridges across Canada.
Best for not being nervous while doing this.
No,
Yes.
not at all.
But it must have been real fun going downhill.
Yeah. You'd mentioned something about pouring sand on the tracks to help your brakes grip better.
Yeah, so typically in a locomotive, to get the friction, you have sand loaded up to create that friction because the idea is to roll quickly. So I'm curious what kind of braking devices they would have had on these going such long distances. And clearly, if they broke down, not only are you in trouble, but you are blocking the only way across the country. And you'll see several shots here where here come the steam locomotives. Um, Carrying all that cargo going across the country, and they pull the cars aside at these very, very rural locations.
Mhm.
But some, yeah, just wonderful shots that you can only get by rail, even today in northern Ontario. They do a little bragging out there.
Yeah.
Got out and walked over the onto the rail bridge. So this would have been uh, quite one of the highlights of their trip to stare down at this northern Ontario waterfall, which is, as we've been talking about this, all these sites are still here today. So if you take the rail, through northern Ontario, you'll still go through these same exact canyons and locations.
Mhm. Agawa Canyon National Park is actually notable because it's still only accessible by railway. It's one of the only routes or spots on this whole trip that you still cannot drive to, unless you happen to have a Model T with flanged wheels. But I feel like CN Rail wouldn't like that very much.
Well, September 22nd, time for snow.
Yeah.
There we go.
Overall, though, I mean, depending on when they were filming, they seem to have locked out in terms of weather. Nothing too appalling given the season.
There's some track switching here.
Yeah, you see a really interesting mix of trains too. When we were in sort of the logging areas of northwestern Ontario, it was logging trains, and now suddenly it's all passenger trains crossing Western Ontario to the prairies.
There's the Ford Special, 12:10 p.m. It's worth noting that this, would have had to been scheduled with the rail lines to make sure that Model T wasn't holding up traffic.
Yeah.
It would have been quite a sight. Only a little bit of pressure to have to make it from point A to point B, and not go missing. There was no way to contact anyone uh, during these, while they were out there.
Yeah. Yeah, it could well be they had a way to tap into the telegraph lines, but if they did, it's certainly not mentioned, and we never see them using it. So,
Yeah. So we have the locomotive and the tender behind it with all that coal.
yeah, and certainly less so in the road segments, but all these rail lines, nearly all of them are still there in exactly the same spots. You can still ride the train along Lake Superior at these spots. Oh, hi, Clark. Were there different rail gauges in play? As far as we can tell, no, I don't think so. But they certainly later on you'll see they had a whole separate set of axles made for the car we see a detailed sort of walkthrough of how they change the wheels on and off. And it's not just swapping, tires and putting flange wheels in place. They put a whole new set of axles on the suspension. So it may have been that they could adjust as they went.
So Wayne has a good question about gas stations. And our theory is you can sort of spot it. So we believe there's probably 3 cars that went. And one would have been the supply car that they're not, with their luggage and everything they needed in it. So I'm guessing they're out there for 40 days and they've condensed it into 1 hour. So I'm guessing our theory is they definitely offloaded a lot of the stuff they were carrying.
Yeah.
There's great old photos of people traveling, and there's all that stuff tied to the hood and the sides of the car and so forth. So I'm guessing they likely would have had fuel and so forth for the trip
Yeah.
as they were going.
This is certainly after the invention of the gas station. So gas stations would have been available. We just don't see any. Also, crucially, there's never any footage from inside the moving car. We don't know what conditions were in the car. Maybe the cameras weren't good enough to film from the vehicle, but at no point do they show the shot from the driver's perspective that I'm aware of anyway.
David has another great question about how coincidentally a Model T being the right width to go onto railway tracks, right gauge in Canada, and that is a great question. I will look into.
I think they had specialized parts because again we see later on they swap out at the very least the front axle, so they'd packed kit where they could alter the wheelbase. I don't think the base Model T's wheelbase it's close, but it's not exactly railway gauge.
Yeah.
There were certainly some early cars, Orient buckboards spring to mind, that did deliberately have their wheels set at standard railway gauges specifically for doing this kind of stuff, but the Model Ts were not one of them.
I see a whole other talk we can get into, Dumaresq, on driving the rails.
Yeah.
Certainly an obscure yet talk full of fascinating footage. Oh, here we are at a roundhouse, which is exciting. Switching which tracks it's on.
It's a pity. I feel like there's probably 20 minutes of cool roundhouse footage that they had to cut down to 30 seconds. Battle cars this time, and looks like passengers in the back.
Wheels are back on. And it looks like a high quality, I guess that's a road they're driving on. It's a little unclear, but that's about what they have to work with.
Yeah.
Now, yeah, some of these rural towns, you can tell this is quite the excitement.
Yeah.
As Dr. Doolittle is in Dryden, Ontario.
Yeah. Now, the obvious question here is, did he really drive all the way across northern Ontario with them? He was like 68 when this was filmed. Probably not.
So yeah, you can't get too far from Dryden at this time by automobile. So they're gonna have to once again jump back on the railway, the rail tracks, to get towards to get into Manitoba. Well, that is they certainly enjoy these shots of the steam locomotives going by.
Yeah.
Which it would have been fantastic if they had sound to give you the full impact of how loud that would have been.
Yeah, one of the things we've been wondering, this is at a time period when just before sort of sound pictures started to become a thing, where narrated or lecture movies were very popular. Like you go to a movie theater, it's a silent film, but you have basically what we're doing, live commentary happening over the film. So we've been wondering whether or not this film is missing a lot of detail because the idea was you'd have the driver or Perry Doolittle possibly talking over it to the crowd and answering questions as they went. Also, notice that they're using the term Trans-Canada Highway. There wouldn't be a Trans-Canada Highway until 1949-ish. So the term long predates the actual building of the highway that we now know and love or hate today.
Yeah.
You can also see they're dragging a gravel road, the classic simplest possible Canadian highway construction.
It's a real bouncy ride right there. So
we'll soon be leaving the Canadian Shield and going into the Canadian mud for all of the prairies.
that highway they just showed didn't actually go anywhere yet.
No.
So they drove down it, turned around, got back on the train. So yeah, we're gonna cross into Manitoba now, which suddenly looks very flat.
No. Note the mayor of Winnipeg's car is much larger and fancier than the Model T. So one thing that's a little odd, you'll see there's a fairly heavy focus on Winnipeg, which at the time had a Ford factory making Model Ts, and they never mentioned it in the film, which seems like an odd choice. Also, great shot of the Seven Sisters. So you'll see they do some stuff at the Seven Sisters you can no longer do today. Driving on them, that is. And we're up to 6 Auto Club badges.
Very much reminiscent of modern, SUV commercials where this might happen in your Land Rover or your Ford pickup, your Ford F-150. You might have to drive across this type of terrain. So it's certainly not a new marketing gimmick to imagine this is what's going to happen.
Or contrast your high-tech car with the latest high-tech water management hardware, like the big locks outside of Winnipeg. Yeah, some really spectacularly busy, chaotic street scenes in Winnipeg. This is just as the horse is finally starting to disappear off Canadian streets, but not quite yet. And before
the on the streetcar track, not actually in the car.
Yeah. Yeah, that was debatably filmed from a car, quite possibly from a streetcar.
Yeah, it seemed a bit too high up.
Mm-hmm. Too steady.
And here comes the gumbo, which is
Yeah.
a great 1920s word.
So
just describe this type of situation.
Extremely clay topsoil layer that just turns to mush when you put a car over it. So interestingly, this is the backup car. This is the only good shot we see of the 2, possibly 3 cars in the convoy together. Still not certain it's 3, but this was the whole convoy. We've got the newer new Ford and a much junkier older model Ford as a cargo.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it looks sort of fun to do, but maybe not for days on end.
Yeah. Also, you'll notice that Perry Doolittle has again disappeared from the traveling company. I think possibly for the entire rest of the trip.
Now we're heading west out of Brandon towards Saskatchewan.
Yeah,
I can see a bit of snow in early October.
mostly mud.
No, clearly not frozen over yet because it's still quite muddy.
Mm-hmm. Though you'll notice if you look closely, there are they've put chains on the tires. Good shot of it there. Old piece of technology.
Very safe rail crossing.
We've just done all of Manitoba in less than 5 minutes. Wonders of editing.
Hats were very popular in 1925.
Yeah. Okay, so this is a good shot of our pilot on the left. We don't know who he is, but he clearly did 90% of the driving. He turns up in all the Western shots with varying degrees of sunburn and stubble and mud on his face. So well done, whoever you were. We wish we knew who you are. Also back when Moose Jaw had streetcars.
Very slow go out of Moose Jaw. So this seems like it was the most difficult part of the journey by automobile was
Yeah.
getting into Western Saskatchewan.
They brag about having almost no breakdowns, but they never say how many times they had to get out and push, which I'm sure was a lot.
So
This is actually a lot what the first road crossing of Canada looked like, where you're just driving across open fields, especially earlier on in as the prairies were being settled. The road networks hadn't solidified yet, so the road was whatever the most straight line was. Pete's asking about promotional materials. We have not found much, if any, evidence of any kind of collectibles or things they sold along the way. Collectible postcards were really popular at this time for these kinds of endurance driving and have never stumbled across anything for this drive. It's odd, the real lack of substantial advertising promotion. I mean, maybe the movie was the big promotional thing, but certainly I have never seen any kind of promo material for this whole epic trip. They did talk about it in their advertising for the car, but it was kind of a nice little sidebar instead of being the primary thing.
no, they start to get a little stir crazy by the time they get to Alberta.
Yeah.
We start there's more and more jokes thrown in about, yeah, I bet you could go 10 miles an hour. And, and these very rural towns.
Yeah, they also the prairies are crucially where they clearly stopped regularly cleaning the car. Um, you can tell they kind of gave up after a while. And for the rest of the movie, the car will just get dirtier and dirtier and dirtier until they hit the very end. Yeah, once again, like these were big community events, this car arriving in town.
And they did not even bother to wipe it off for this mayor.
The pilot did have time to shave, though, crucially. If anybody is from Lethbridge and knows why only the acting mayor showed up, we'd be very curious to know who was acting Mayor Freeman and why was he acting.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's notable that they had to note that this was a government built road because that was an extremely rare thing at the time. Um, Legislation to even consider the federal government funding road building only started to go into effect in about 1921 and then on a very limited scope. Yeah, this is my crazy conspiracy moment of was there a third car? Because you'll see there are three Model Ts in a line there with the trip car in front with all the badges. Was there a third car? We don't know. And it was probably full of film equipment if it was there. Just transporting the film on this trip would have been incredibly hazardous. I mean, this is the era when film liked to burst into flame and explode at the drop of a hat. So transporting a country's worth of film footage in a moving vehicle was hazardous at the best of times. We're also desperately curious to know what happened to this scroll.
Mhm.
The Henry Ford Museum doesn't appear to have it, so who knows where it ended up. But they clearly scanned it or microfilmed it in some way. It's kind of impressive that they hard committed to driving into the Rockies in early October. I feel like even nowadays with good highways, doing any kind of driving into the Rockies at the even remotely close to the start of the winter season can be an exercise in danger. So Rocky Mountain Park is now Banff National Park. That gate still exists in some form, I think, heavily updated. But this is 5 years before Banff National Park became that Banff National Park. It had only recently become a national park at all. I love this shot of Banff because you could probably take the exact same shot today.
Mhm.
It was
But
spectacular then and spectacular now.
there's a Starbucks and so forth there now. It's
Yeah, yeah,
but still the same idea.
yeah. Oh yeah, so we get an editing error that's evidence that this is not completely raw footage. Back in the 1920s, film reels were about 15 minutes long. This is a 4 reel film. Um, so depending on how good your movie theater was, you might get a short intermission as they swap the reels over in the cameras, or if they dropped something or something came unstuck. You'll also notice, like, considering the terrain, all the roads through the Rockies are really, really nice because they were all brand new tourist roads. This is right as the government of British Columbia and the government of Alberta are ramping up car tourism in the Rockies. So suddenly you get fancy road signs and post markers and a nice cleared provincial border. All of that stuff was brand new to help essentially just with tourist navigation. Medium Hot Springs, still a popular and only slightly radioactive tourist destination. One, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight. 8 badges plus the buffalo there. Yeah, so this is I'm very curious about this shot because Sinclair Canyon is a very famous hiking spot, but to my knowledge, it doesn't currently have a road through it. So it's unclear if this is a part of Sinclair Canyon that's now not very well traveled, or if the road has since been turned into a hiking path. This is also all one of the sort of big themes the BC government liked to play up in their early car tourism was hints or links to the BC Gold Rush. So the town of Golden, which unsurprisingly was established to help with the BC and the Yukon gold rushes, was one of the hubs of local tourism and got a lot of really aggressive road development. There's lots of highways through the Rockies that existed at this time that actually no longer exist because they were kind of built higgledy-piggledy to accommodate, what individual municipalities thought were needed.
There's Golden. That bridge is still there across the Kicking Horse. That's very much Golden, BC. Now it's sort of a little bit out of order if you've been out there. So you would have gone through Lake Louise first from Banff, but editing. But yeah, so the cars are much higher. The railway is actually down along the Kicking Horse there. You can see there the railway line going through. So there wasn't enough room for both the highway and the rail line. So the railways got there first. That bridge is still there.
Yeah. Lots of these highways went, or at least pretended to follow older pioneer trails up in the mountains, and in several cases actually deliberately relocated historic buildings to make it look like they followed the older pioneer trails, even if they didn't.
You can tell they really like the footage of BC compared to Saskatchewan. They begrudgingly drove across. So here they could have jumped back on the railway lines, but don't. So here, yeah. So now it's gonna get a little too difficult to navigate with an automobile. So they're gonna have to do a little bit more of using those.
There's the famous detachable axle.
Yeah.
And special parts. Yeah, I want to know how much lifting of the car with trees happened on this trip, because I bet it was a lot.
And that's basically how you move cars at the museum with the few 2x4s. So yeah, you put the wheels on and off you go. Things like this are the reason you could not drive. So clearly there are rail bridges, but it's going to take a lot longer to build car bridges across these types of hazards out west.
So the timing on this isn't clear, but from my research, the Connaught Tunnel was either under construction or had just finished construction at the time they filmed this, and it was famously like a really nasty construction job that took much longer than usual.
Here's
Also,
another joke about literally driving blind through this tunnel. So quite a thing.
look, Alex, driving for 40 days continuously is hard.
I mean, you gotta switch it up as a filmmaker.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, lots of these little railway towns that clearly only existed at the time as hubs for getting stuff onto and off of trains.
Mhm. Particularly coal.
Yeah.
Oh, here's some CP box cars. Trying to get on and off here. Um, we're almost there, almost done. We're gonna quickly. They're not gonna go all the way to Victoria, just to Vancouver.
Yeah.
Uh, car's been cleaned up a little bit, not as much mud
Yeah.
by the time we get out towards Kamloops. Um,
Don't know who Mayor Mann was, but clearly was not comfortable on camera. Yeah, so this is starting to, oh yeah, these are the Victoria or BC Cowboys at a time when the government of British Columbia employed several professional cowboys to add historic color to their highways, for what it's worth. Yeah, this is starting to be sort of the Fraser Canyon area, and actually some of the earliest driving footage we have from 1912, 1913, 1914 comes from this very same area, going west to east along the Fraser Canyon. This is one of the, or would become one of the earliest kind of scenic drives in Canada on the roads that went along this rail line. Weren't very good roads, but they were there. And the view, as you can see, is very pretty.
our last rail bridges we'll be utilizing.
I guess after the Fraser, it's all downhill to the coast. Theoretically. I am no BC geography expert, I'll be the first to admit.
Oh, another driving through a tunnel picture.
Tunnels and car headlights were both very new and exciting things, circa 1925. Gotta show them off. So Hell's Gate is now quite a popular tourist site along this area of BC. With they've replaced the pedestrian suspension bridge with a very elaborate cable car. But what a bridge! What a bridge!
Well worth the drive to walk over that.
Yeah.
That's the real gold rush fantasy there.
Mm-hmm.
It's sure better than than Saskatchewan. There you go.
I detect a certain bitterness in the intertitles, a certain regret. Yeah, so Alex, you were mentioning earlier about having to sort of register this as a train, and they were picking up the message capsules and at least pretending to race trains.
Yes, they're quite the promotion. Just to put things in perspective, that locomotive is about 16 feet tall compared to the Model T.
Yeah, it was all about the gold rush. Gold rush, gold rush, gold rush. That's what brought in the tourists. Everybody wanted to follow the trails of the gold rush and see the scenic gold rush sites and look at the brand new, just introduced by the government of British Columbia historical plaques. These were the first highway history plaques in Canada, and they went up along the gold rush route starting in about 1921, 1922. So this is the ancestor of every highway side tourist plaque you have ever seen anywhere in the country. I think this one in particular is no longer right by the highway. They moved it into a park behind a gas station, if I recall.
You can see the rails, you can see the telegraph lines down there, the phone lines as well.
Need to bring in a telegraph expert.
Down to our last bit of driving here as we come into Vancouver. So you can see there's not a lot of roadway between from Vancouver into the main into the interior at this time.
Yeah.
So now we're reaching our end here.
Yeah.
Oops.
Yeah, and again, they're clearly from the crowds. There was some kind of fanfare, but I've looked through some of the Vancouver newspapers from the time, and there wasn't much in the papers about this. Much to my considerable surprise. Maybe I've been looking in the wrong spot, but for the amount of time and effort and cooperation between Ford and all these towns and CP Rail at the time, it is kind of surprising how unremembered this saga of a road trip was, and poorly documented too.
There we go. We're at the end. There's no grand finale or anything.
Yeah.
They clearly would have shipped the car. I don't know what they would have done with the cars if they would have sold them there. The guys would have taken clearly would have taken the train home.
Yeah.
But yeah, we always have more questions after our talks than answers, it seems.
Yeah, I've not been able to track down either of the cars involved with this.
I doubt I couldn't sell it as a new car anymore after that many miles.
No. But I mean, if what they claimed is true, 4 punctures and a adjustment, whatever that means. I don't know if I buy it, but
yeah, it seems
yeah.
Given some of those roads they were driving on, but so yeah, 4794 miles, 853 they had to do by rail.
There's our driver. He made it, whoever he is. They don't give his name, alas. If you recognize him, please let us know. We'd love to know who he was. It's also, you'll notice the film is about to cut out very dramatically after. I love that the dog was blocking the shot. Perfect ending. Dip the wheels into the ocean and the dog is in the way. And then 1 frame of the end and bam, boom, video done. So that's the 1925 cross-Canada road trip. It's a story, as Alex said, with far more questions than answers. It's something we know a lot about. Oh, Mark says that the driver is Ed Flickinger, the Ford staff photographer. Intriguing. We've had a break in the case. So we have a name. Well, now we have to do this again, but with more detail. I'm going to make you sit through this whole film strip one more time, Alex. Even more color commentary. Mark, if you have a source or more details on Ed Flickinger and his involvement in this, please send them along to me. I would love to know more. But yeah, in the same vein as the film, we are at almost 8:10. We've taken up plenty of your time. Thank you so much for tuning in. I know this has been very different than our usual format, but thank you all so much for joining us. And we'll have a recording of this up online in the next few days. But any last words, Alex?
No, thanks, Dumaresq. Thanks for inviting me to join in still. And you guys have some great talks lined up for the fall and into 2025 as well, I hear.
Yeah, stay
So
tuned for Bricklin, Russell, Tudhope, and coming down the pipe for 2025, our first talk on American motors. So if you're an AMC fan, it's coming. It's coming.
excellent. And are there new cars at the museum these days?
Oh, a couple. We've got our first Pontiac. We may have our first Toyota Corolla coming down the pipe, but that's very hush hush. You didn't hear it from me. So stay tuned for more, both virtually and in person at the museum. And thank you all so much.